A specter is haunting Picrew Avatar Twitter. The specter of transsexualism. Is that a little dramatic? That feels a little dramatic. Let's try... Webster's dictionary defines binary as... Okay, screw it. There's been this tension in the trans community as of late. A slowly reifying cultural divide that's known to get people defensive and going to bat for their side. I'm talking about the micro-culture war that is binary trans versus non-binary. Which side is more radical, more persecuted, more valid? Many a hand is wrung over the cultural image of the binary trans woman. She is thin, white, and feminine. She is well-off, well-liked, and passes as cis. And according to many, she's holding the movement back with her exclusionary old-fashioned ways. Positioned opposite her is the cultural image of the non-binary person, who is framed both as more persecuted and more radical. But where do these images come from? Who does this divide serve? And why am I in my closet right now? Worry not, dear viewer. Today, some of these questions and more will be answered as I solve gender once and for all. You're welcome. Though it's had something of a resurgence the past few years, this conflict is really nothing new. In fact, it's probably been a source of tension in the trans community about as long as there's been a trans community. We've seen it take many forms over the years. The persecuted true trans versus the attention-seeking trender, the autogynephile versus the homosexual. Despite different specifics, these infights have a lot in common. A false dichotomy is created and used to sort the community. One side declares itself more legitimate and accuses the other of holding the movement back with their differing needs or priorities. There's a push to decenter the opposing camp, who are said to be less persecuted and taking up too much space. I wrote in my notes Oppression Olympics, which would have been a very timely bit of wordplay if this video came out on time. Clearly that never happens. The deepest of these divides is also the oldest, transsexual versus transgender. The word transgender is used as an umbrella term nowadays, but that wasn't always the case. In the early days of the community, it had a specifically non-medical connotation. In a 1994 essay titled My Words to Victor Frankenstein Above the Village of Chamonix, Susan Stryker explains,
"The word was originally coined as a noun in the 1970s by people who resisted categorization as either transvestites or transsexuals, and who used the term to describe their own identity. Unlike transsexuals, but like transvestites, transgenders do not seek surgical alteration of their bodies, but do habitually wear clothing that represents a gender other than the one to which they were assigned at birth. Unlike transvestites, but like transsexuals, however, transgenders do not alter the vestimentary coding of their gender only episodically or primarily for sexual gratification. Rather, they consistently and publicly express an ongoing commitment to their claimed gender identities through the same visual representational strategies used by others to signify that gender."
Nowadays, a person's choice to medically transition or not is given a lot less weight and not understood to say much about who you are, at least in theory. But at the advent of the modern trans community, it hugely impacted where you hung out, how you lived, what resources you could access. Some self-described transsexuals shuddered at the thought of being lumped in with people who don't take hormones. There was, in some cases, a push to prove that trans people could be just like normal people, and cross-dressers and non-transitioners were inconvenient to that goal, so in some cases they were left out. Despite these conflicts ostensibly being about tactics, people were grouped into one camp or the other, not based on their politics, but based on their personal choices. This one incredibly personal choice was used to infer so much about a person, their relationship to gender, their level of persecution, and therefore their affiliation in this intra-community divide. You have to imagine this split alienated a lot of people. Grouping the nascent community into two separate halves created a new binary that necessarily left a lot of people out. For instance, how do you classify someone who went on T for a year and then stopped? How do you classify someone who wants hormones but not surgery? And of course, many people wanted no part in this divide to begin with. Your gender politics aren't perfectly predicted by your choice to take hormones. How do you classify a textbook transsexual who doesn't buy into this debate, doesn't identify strongly with either term, and lives in community with medicalized and non-medicalized alike? Is she still on your team? As the years went on, it became increasingly clear that this transsexual-transgender divide isn't as clean a line as we thought. By the 2010s, the distinction had largely been left behind, with both terms still seeing use today, but not really being understood as rigidly defined or mutually exclusive. The culture war seemed to be over, but the tension that created this divide simmered on. The urge to dispose of one another in the name of progress. The resentment stirred by some folks' desire to assimilate. Though the trans community is arguably more unified than it's ever been, this push continues to split us down the middle with a similar tactic as before, taking the choices a person makes, using those choices to assign a person a label, and using that label to assume their political allegiance. I think this is what's happening between the binary trans and non-binary camps. There's been an increased delineation between the two sides, an attempt to turn a group as diverse as non-binary people into a coherent ideological bloc, one whose interests are in conflict with those of binary trans people. Where binary trans people are understood to be moderate and assimilationist, non-binary people are portrayed as the radical gender vanguard, challenging norms left and right. Where binary trans people are understood as privileged and more widely accepted, non-binary people are understood as a put-upon minority who's more often a target. This seems like a pretty wide gulf, and I can't say I see it reflected in the people I know. The trans people in my life tend to run into similar challenges regardless of gender: rejection from families, medical and legal discrimination, general ignorance. I wouldn't say the trans women I know are meaningfully more privileged than the non-binary people I know, or vice versa. The difference just feels kind of played up. I think in the trans community and in many progressive spaces, we put too much stock in identity. That's not to say labels are useless. As I've said before, finding language to describe yourself can be life-changing. But treating identity as a perfect predictor for the problems we run into, or framing the whole conversation of oppression around how individuals identify, I feel like it misses a lot. Nearly everything even. Because, of course, the driver of transphobia isn't identity alone. How you label yourself does have some impact on how people treat you, but more relevant is how you move through the world, how you look and dress and sound, the steps you take in your transition, the people you hang around. Unless you're walking around with a pin on, strangers don't know your deeply felt gender for sure. It often comes down to what people assume about your gender based on how you present yourself. Julia Serano, in her seminal book Whipping Girl, calls this process gendering. A lot of note tabs on here. Pretty impressive, right? I can't take credit. I borrowed this from a cis high school teacher like 3 years ago that I never saw him again. Shout out to that guy, true ally. If I woke up one day and realized I was genderqueer, I'm not sure much about my life would change. I wouldn't stop experiencing misogyny or transmisogyny. The way people perceive me would probably stay about the same. Institutions like schools and hospitals wouldn't treat me any differently. My precise identity has never really mattered to them. All they care about is that my birth certificate says male and I look like this. They'll make their same assumptions and probably sort me into the same box they would have otherwise. How am I so sure of this? Well, I've privately identified as genderqueer for ages, and in the time since, nothing has changed. Not my relationships, not the discrimination I face, nothing. Why? Because I haven't really told anyone. A couple close friends and now several thousand internet strangers. But other than that, nothing. I haven't changed my pronouns or my gender marker because I'm okay being read as a woman, so I don't feel the need. I may be genderqueer, but I interact with the world the same as many supposedly binary trans women. Identity doesn't always line up with your gendering. There are non-binary people who are read as non-binary and as cis men and as cis women and as trans men and as trans women and some combination of the five depending on the day. There are no categorical across-the-board differences between binary and non-binary trans people, not pronouns nor biology nor lived experience. This is why I'm skeptical of attempts to sort us into any two categories. It'll always be at least a little immaterial. If a dividing line between binary and non-binary people can't be observed in nature, we have to draw it ourselves. So how do we draw that line? When we talk about binary trans people, how do we decide who counts? Because I don't think it's a self-reporting thing. It's pretty rare to come across someone who describes themselves as a binary trans person. This label is most often applied from the outside, sometimes with a negative connotation. So when we gender someone as a binary trans person, what cues are we looking for? I don't have data to back this up, only experience and intuition, and I have no way to say how this works for transmasculine folks, but for trans femmes, I think it comes down to 4 main things. Using she/her pronouns, going by a female name, presenting as a feminine woman, and pursuing medical transition. If you make most or all of these choices in tandem, people tend to assume you're a woman, plain and simple, no bells or whistles. A glaring oversight of this categorization is that many of those in it don't identify as binary at all. I know quite a few people who check most or all of these boxes, but don't identify as trans women. To group us all together based on our presentation and our bodies is to apply gendering in the same way as cisgender society does, and that means misgendering at least a few of us. Your transition might be understood as more traditional than your outwardly non-conforming peers, and therefore more socially acceptable. From here, people tend to read into your motives. Trans women judged as binary are assumed to prioritize assimilation. After all, we must want to be the same as cis women if we're so hung up on copying them, right? To this end, the term binary trans people is sometimes used as a stand-in for conservatives or assimilationists, the Blair Whites and Buck Angels of the world, who make up a tiny sliver of the actual trans population. So it's not just privilege projected onto us, but also a political leaning. To be privileged is to be politically inferior, and repression itself is virtuous. The writer Alex V. Green noted a parallel online movement dubbed tenderqueers, which is also known to weaponize accusations of privilege against trans women.
By this point in 2020, the internet has thoroughly hammered into us that one's politics are a matter of personal identity, and that one's identity may itself stand in for their politics. So you cannot critique the tenderqueer, because they are queer, which means they are radical, and they are traumatized, which means they are a victim, and therefore that they are radical. And if you have an issue, that's your political failure, and so on.
The idea that this constructed category of binary trans women is more privileged and therefore less radical, I understand where it comes from. It's true that there's something of a blueprint for trans feminine people to follow. Many of us do want to be treated the same as cis women. The kind of clear-cut transition goal that doesn't exist for the whole community. We've all heard the age-old question, how do you pass as non-binary? There's a frame of reference for us that doesn't exist for all gender minorities. Trans women have been represented in the media for decades now, and that's always gone great. And at some points, yes, the people in this group have engaged in gender policing. Obviously, I don't condone that, but I don't think it's ever been a majority of us. In contrast, the relative newness of non-binary genders in the public eye seems revolutionary. A group whose very existence challenges ideas of what bodies can look like, what people can be. A group for which no fixed gender roles exist. And yeah, this is sick. Being non-binary is nonconformist and does pose some real challenges to the current system. But I think that's just as true of so-called binary trans people. I think transitioning at all is a total transgression of the gender binary. Uh-oh, we're doing theory. This will be easy to follow, don't worry. A lot of misogyny is rooted in the understanding of the sexes as immutable, natural, and mutually exclusive. Julia Serano calls this oppositional sexism, as in opposite. Oppositional sexism holds that the differences between the genders are innate and have nothing to do with culture. Therefore, if some disparity exists between the genders, it's nothing to worry about because it's perfectly natural. You can see right away how this would help uphold patriarchy. If men are harassing women on the street, it's because they just can't help themselves. If women aren't graduating with as many STEM degrees, it's because women just aren't interested in science. It's clear how oppositional sexism should govern cis people. They're who the gender binary was designed around. But transsexuals throw a real wrench in the works. How can you claim that sex is immutable when we're right here? How can you claim that men are naturally competitive, dominant, and hairy, while also insisting people like me are men? Our existence calls into question oppositional sexism's core claim that the gender binary is natural and that what is natural is good. Our success in crossing the gender divide proves it was never impossibly wide to begin with. In the same essay I quoted earlier, Susan Stryker revels in the unnaturality of her body and the way it terrifies cis society.
I, who have dwelt in a form unmatched with my desire. I, whose flesh has become an assemblage of incongruous anatomical parts. I, who achieved the similitude of a natural body only through an unnatural process. I offer you this warning. The nature you bedevil me with is a lie. Do not trust it to protect you from what I represent, for it is a fabrication that cloaks the groundlessness of the privilege you seek to maintain for yourself at my expense. You are as constructed as me. The same anarchic womb has birthed us both.
It's an incredible essay. You should definitely read it. When people talk about so-called binary trans women as if we're old-fashioned conformists, I wonder if they miss this? How we're the object of such fear and disgust. How medically transitioning undermines the foundation of the gender binary, which is the sex binary. This is a fundamental difference between cis women and trans women. Cis women existing doesn't by itself undermine the gender binary. And let me tell you, being perceived as a threat to gender, not a great time. Can't say I'm a fan. Let's return to those 4 choices from earlier. The ones people use to assume you're a binary trans woman. Using she, her pronouns, going by a female name, presenting as a feminine woman, and pursuing medical transition. To call these choices conformist feels out of touch because society doesn't encourage us to do any of this. In fact, most of my material struggles on the gender front have stemmed from one of these 4 things. If becoming a woman was normative, wouldn't it be easier? It was really fucking hard to get on hormones as a teenager. Even in Canada, with allegedly universal healthcare, there's no widespread protocol to help trans youth access hormones. At least there wasn't 5 years ago. So I had to navigate this confusing healthcare system mostly alone or with friends who were just as lost as I was. The only reason I got a prescription at all is because I lied to the clinic about my age. In Minecraft. Satire. Considering the category of binary trans woman is constructed around these choices, it's odd that those inside are deemed privileged. In transitioning and living as women, the challenge we present to oppositional sexism makes us the targets of a lot of vitriol. It's the reason they put up barriers to medical transition and try to keep us out of single-gendered spaces. They want so desperately for the male-female distinction to mean something, and it just doesn't. There's a power struggle at the core of trans femininity, and that struggle is against the gender binary. When I look back on my transition, back to that 16-year-old coming out to her family and classmates, I still get a pit in my stomach. I'm really grateful she pushed on and insisted on being seen, but in crossing boundaries and blurring lines, she endured so much trauma. From school, from doctors, from people I thought I could trust. The repercussions leave my ears ringing even now. Brace yourselves, I got a scalding hot take coming in here. The thing about transphobia is, oh boy, the thing about transphobia is it doesn't happen to cis people, usually. And that's kind of a big deal, because transphobia has a huge impact on what my gender means for my everyday life. This is another flaw in the notion of binary trans women. It assumes trans feminine people experience womanhood in the same way as cis women, but that's often not the case. I talked about this extensively in my video Girls Own the Void, so I won't retread too much here. But basically, many people don't want us to be women, so there's a pretty narrow set of behaviors that's socially acceptable for us. When we deviate from gendered expectations, we're punished more harshly than our cis counterparts might be, even by well-meaning allies. Hell, even by other trans people. I don't know if there's any way around this. At a couple points in my life, I've been stealth, meaning the people around me thought I was a cis woman. Even that wasn't as simple as living out binary cis womanhood, though. I had to hide a big part of myself to keep it up. My transness is relevant to how I think of myself and how I think of the world. It honestly felt like performing a wholly different gender, though I know many stealth people don't share that opinion. I resent the assumption that so-called binary trans people's genders are simpler than our non-binary counterparts. We all live such multifaceted lives, with different parts of our identities clashing with one another. According to traditional values, even the most milquetoast trans woman is a walking heap of contradictions, and they may be wrong, but their opinion is sadly still relevant. People who wish harm on trans women don't care if we identify as trans women or not, because they don't think it's up to us. Any outward expression of femininity, any move away from maleness, is seen as a personal failure. That's rarely the case for cis women, whose femininity, is understood by these types as natural. Inferior, but natural. Beyond that, the gender binary is a system individuals don't have much say in. Even if a woman wholeheartedly identifies as a woman, her identity is only one piece of a much bigger puzzle. Calling individuals binary for being male or female is like calling individuals hierarchical for working in an office. It implies a voice within the system we don't actually have. The binary is something we're subjected to, whether or not we're willing participants. This is why I'm increasingly identifying as genderqueer. It's not that I'm not a woman in some way, but that my gender means a lot of freaky, confusing things because I'm queer. Maybe in a perfectly equal world, I would just be a woman, but in this messy, four-dimensional society, with my hair short, my junk man-made, and my planet fucking dying, it's not so simple anymore. If we can agree that this struggle is a part of one's gender, let's take it a step further. It's not just whether you're cis or trans that affect your gendered experiences, right? There are other factors that hugely impact what we expect of a woman and her ability to conform to gender roles. So many factors alter what your gender means in your life. Your religion, its rules might ask you to dress or behave a certain way. Your nationality and your culture, it might be hard for you to access education. Your health and disability, disabled women are frequently degendered. I can't get pregnant, and that's basically what this whole gender was defined around. Does a white North American woman have the same gender as a retiree in Morocco or a schoolgirl in Indonesia? We might all call ourselves the same thing, but in terms of what that gender means, I'm not so sure. With that in mind, can we call any woman, any individual, binary? The more I think about it, the less it makes sense to. Looking at the divergent experiences of women all across the world, it seems out of touch to call womanhood a monolithic experience. The idea of individual women as binary seems to run up against intersectionality, especially when you consider who wields the power to include or exclude people from that group. Who defines the archetypal binary woman? Say it with me now. It's white people. In a North American context, binary womanhood is white womanhood. White women are viewed as the purest, most natural ideal of womanhood, to which all other women must be compared. The experiences of white women are rarely acknowledged as specific to us. Instead, they're treated as the default. In the excellent Women, Race, and Class, Angela Davis contextualizes the cultural divide between white and black women as it first emerged during the slave trade and then widened during the Industrial Revolution. Proportionately, more black women have always worked outside their homes than their white sisters. The slave system defined black people as chattel. Since women, no less than men, were viewed as profitable labor units, they may as well have been genderless as far as the slaveholders were concerned. As the ideology of femininity, a byproduct of industrialization, was popularized and disseminated through the new ladies' magazines and romantic novels, white women came to be seen as inhabitants of a sphere totally severed from the realm of productive work. The cleavage between the home and the public economy, brought on by industrial capitalism, established female inferiority more firmly than ever before. Woman became synonymous in the prevailing propaganda with mother and housewife, and both mother and housewife bore the fatal mark of inferiority. But But among black female slaves, this vocabulary was nowhere to be found. The economic arrangements of slavery contradicted the hierarchical sexual roles incorporated in the new ideology. As the modern cultural image of the woman filled in, the experiences of Black women and other women of color were largely ignored. The dehumanization of women of color is often coupled with a systematic degendering. Consider how dark skin is understood as masculine, and skin lightening creams are mostly sold to women. A great deal of racism has been enacted in the name of protecting this innocent white ideal, not least against women of color deemed too masculine. Consider the dozens of cisgender women of color who've been shut out of professional sports on account of hyperandrogenism, meaning their testosterone levels are higher than normal for women. Guess who we use as the baseline for what's normal? The cultural image of the binary trans woman is also extremely racialized. The phrase is used to evoke an image of a woman who is gender conforming, yes, but also wealthy and white. Treating white women's experiences as default here erases trans women of color, who are often left behind in these debates about binary privilege. It's a kind of tacit degendering that I find really gross, telling trans women of color that they can be women, but they'll never be the feminine ideal. I think the image of the binary trans woman erases women of color because ascribing them privilege on the basis of being binary reveals the absurdity of basing these conversations about privilege on identity and not on conditions. Arguing that there is one coherent monolithic womanhood and that trans women conform to it lends immense power to whoever gets to define what that womanhood is. It also unintentionally argues for the usefulness of the gender binary, the idea that the binary is natural and universal and predicts how we live. Of course, none of this takes away from the importance of organizing as women for women. Across these diverse experiences, there are tons of common threads: objectification, lack of agency, economic repression. Across cultures, women tend to be oppressed for similar reasons. The takeaway here isn't that gender is fake, so we don't need feminism. We do. We absolutely do. But we don't need feminism to treat womanhood as a singular or simple experience. Understanding the diversity of our experiences makes feminism stronger, not weaker. So far, I've gone over how the category of binary trans woman has been defined from the outside and how it glosses over the nuances of trans women's and all women's experiences. But how does the other side of this divide, the non-binary camp, define itself? And where does this urge to separate us come from in the first place? I'm going to make some criticisms here, and before I do, I want to make sure we're all on the same page. When I scrutinized binary trans women, I wasn't coming for the individuals in that group, but the cultural construct around us. In the same way, when I make these criticisms, it's not of non-binary people, individually or as a cultural bloc. I don't think most non-binary people are especially invested in this divide. At least in my circles, trans people of all genders coexist pretty peacefully. My issue isn't with the people, but this cultural shift towards reifying us as one coherent group and the motives behind it. The non-binary community, when distinguishing itself from the broader trans community, positions itself as a counterculture, pushing back not only against broader cis society, but also what's viewed as the trans old guard. Inclusion is a core tenet of many non-binary spaces. Whether you're on hormones or not, whether you've changed your name or your pronouns or not, you're welcome to join in. That said, in defining itself apart from the broader trans community, many non-binary circles have built an image of their community as specifically non-medicalized. I've sometimes even run into an outright disdain for medical transition. This is where the old transsexual v transgender divide reemerges. Where the cultural image of binary trans people includes hormones, the cultural image of non-binary people does not. This cultural image is pretty flawed. A huge amount of non-binary people do medically transition, but this image is less concerned with them, or I guess I could say us. Those who medically transition are in some ways understood as more normative and even more privileged, on account of our increased visibility and cultural prominence. Therefore, the focus is on those outside the traditional trans mold, those who don't change their appearance or pronouns or names, those who don't come out at all. Here, I think intra-community sway is mistaken for actual power. The general centering of people who socially and medically transition can be criticized, but it's not arbitrary. In most cases, it's done because transition makes our life harder and presents real material challenges. People whose transness comes up more often in the real world are naturally more likely to be targeted. That includes people who are framed as binary trans women. I can't tell you how many posts I've seen going around over the years that say something along the lines of, you don't have to change your hair or your makeup or your outfits or your name or your pronouns or your body to be trans. And this is true, and in the context of the trans community, that might seem like a radical statement. But in mainstream society, you don't need to transition is the default opinion. Medical transition isn't some conformist establishment idea, and those who choose it aren't privileged over those who don't. A counterculture that pushes against a counterculture sometimes winds up looking like the culture we started with. Despite positioning itself as more radical, it seems like this tendency might actually have fewer demands than the trans mainstream. Concrete goals take a backseat to abstract ideals with no win states, like empowerment and visibility. These are respectable goals, for sure, but they're not actionable in a wide way, because they respond to individual problems and not collective ones. I wonder why this might be. Look, we all knew it was coming. I would say I'm sorry, but I'm not. I live for this shit. Capitalism has dug its talons into every corner of online space at this point, and the queer community is no exception. It's an unfortunate reality that the biggest queer thought leaders right now are, well, influencers. The people shaping the beliefs of millions of queer youth worldwide rely on advertisers to make a living. To keep their appeal broad and their videos monetized, queer and trans influencers have a real incentive to appear somewhat outside the mainstream without majorly disrupting the status quo. This is the contradiction at the core of social media activism. On that note, this channel is made possible by my supporters on Patreon. For as little as $3 a month, you can become a patron, gaining early access to all my videos, and not one, not two, not three, but 3 exclusive videos you won't find anywhere else. On this channel, we sometimes talk about topics like discrimination and trauma, which are really fun, but not very ad-friendly. If you want to help me make more videos, that is the best way to do it. Thanks to Patreon, I'm not accountable to advertisers, but to my peers. I can't see a single way this would go wrong. Now back to the show.
In this decadent post-RuPaul's Drag Race era, Christ, I wrote that? That's disgusting. Brands are drawn to our community because being queer is edgy, but not too edgy. Aligning with the community makes brands seem modern and progressive, but it doesn't majorly risk their image. Big corporations were nowhere to be found 30 years ago when their advocacy might have actually moved the needle, but now they can't get enough of us. It feels good to be on the cutting edge, but it feels even better to look cutting edge and risk nothing. Radical ideas are inactivated by capital in a process called recuperation. In recuperation, an idea is rebranded and diluted to the point where it means essentially nothing, but it maintains its appealing radical veneer. The ideas can then be sold back to us, allowing us to perform radicalism not by taking action, but by consuming a product.
This twisting of trans advocacy is necessary in order to sell it, both to corporations and a wide audience. There's a pretty narrow subset of trans experiences that are naturally ad-friendly. I don't know how a brand can meaningfully engage with our pressing material needs that have been well articulated for decades. You're gonna have a hard time convincing any hormone user that privatized mail-order hormones are a good idea, though every time someone tries, it makes for a great few hours on Twitter. It's not surprising that they would latch on to an emergent, more nebulous group like non-binary people instead, selling us an individualist framework to understand our oppression, complete with declawed fixes to all our problems. Non-binary people are an incredibly diverse bunch with varying experiences and needs. While that makes for a great community, it doesn't make for a great target demographic. How do you sell to a group of 1 million people, some of whom have nothing in common? This is where the cultural image comes in. In encouraging a monolithic cultural image of the non-binary person, a definitive what non-binary looks like, brands can encircle non-binary people as a new consumer class. They can try to convince us that existing is radical and purchasing is radical, but having material needs is regressive. So they push to dilute terms like visibility, empowerment, and revolution into near meaninglessness. Good ideas for communal action, distorted into individual choices you can make to feel radical. They're selling us complacency. Alex V. Green in Beware the Tenderqueer put it better than I could.
Social media is a marketplace, and the people on it are selling it themselves. This is the seductive logic of neoliberalism. We're taught to think that we can fix state violence through individual pettiness, that we can discharge collective obligations at a whim, and that our personal property is so inviolable that it cannot be shared, trespassed, or redistributed.
If you think your gender is being systematically erased from society, chances are you'll want to do something about it. But if they can get their claws in, they'll convince you you're just feeling invalidated. And the solution to that problem is completely different. Maybe empower yourself by buying this watch. The capitalist version of empowerment serves to placate us, not compel us to make change. To convince us that we don't need to tear the system down, we can find happiness inside it. To feel empowered instead of taking power. I see this idea circulating that as trans people, our very existence is an act of revolution, and it makes me want to tear my hair out because it is so close to getting it. Like, yes, your existence as a trans person is subversive and badass, and you should keep it up. But why is it so controversial? What systems keep it that way? And what can we do to dismantle those systems? On its own, an identity doesn't do all that much. I'm sorry, Aiden from Oakville, Ontario, but your existence is not an act of revolution. We are all literally just some guy. I'm expecting some backlash on this video, and that's okay. I was hoping this could be a jumping off point for a conversation. I don't need it to be the conversation, but I'm expecting to hear that I stepped out of my lane on this one, and I want to get ahead of that. If this video does 1/10 of the numbers as my Mogai video, I'm sure I'll get lots of comments calling me NB-phobic, saying I'm erasing the most vulnerable members of our community. Look, I know it doesn't feel good to be erased. But in depriving us of gender self-determination, in sorting us neatly into this new binary, a lot of people are being erased. And I'm one of them, and it fucking sucks. People have pigeonholed me into the binary trans woman label despite me never identifying that way. I'm not going to hold back on talking about it just because it goes against the norms set by people with a lot less to lose. This constructed ideal of non-binary people as non-medicalized, non-transitioning, and radical in name alone fails all of us. That's why I wrote this video to begin with. If we don't need a monolithic ideal of womanhood to advocate for women, surely we don't need a monolithic ideal of non-binary people to advocate for non-binary people. We can look to the common threads of material struggle, rejection from friends and family, biological determinism, feeling like there's no place for you in your culture. These are things that nearly all trans people face. Across genders, we have immensely more in common than we do separating us. So please don't take this video as my saying binary trans people are oppressed and non-binary people are privileged. My whole point is that the distinction between the two is totally immaterial and accomplishes nothing. Capital has a much easier time conquering this community if we've already divided ourselves. With all this said, I think I'm going to take a break from the gender stuff for a while. It's easy to write about, and I'm glad it resonates with so many people, but it is really starting to wear at me. There's so many other things I'm passionate about, and I hope you'll stick around to hear me talk about them. My next video will be on the surreal beauty of AI-generated art and how capitalism is encroaching on that too. Thank you for sticking till the end of this longest of rants. I hope you got something out of it. I certainly learned a lot while writing. Also, I forgot to film this at the same time as everyone else, but thank you to the friends who sent in voiceover. This must be a little jarring, the shot, eh? Yeah, we're professionals. This video and all my videos are made possible by my supporters on Patreon. So a huge thanks to Jesperi Wirtanen, Hannah Leichnitz, Tracy Sim, Darla Butler, Jen Pseudonym, Cherie Monjovi, Jean, Rebecca Gale, Ruby Landau Pickus, Smaz V, Basil Bennett Levy, Maddie Mahmoud, Pascal, Dr. Haley Isabella Colley, Ariel Goodbody, Mel Catt, Christopher Stilson, Caitlin, Sam Braley, Izzy, Wimbleimble, Detective Meow Meow, Mary Wishart, Vivi, Imogen Campbell, Celeste Blossom, Imogen Waters, Gwen Loffman, Ami Palady, Ivy, Mariah, Alejandro Hernandez, Lee Sloth Pope, Rick Acoy, Kieran McMullen, Taylor Hardy, Guillaume, The Recognition Scene, Ari Runanen-Tell, June, Jacob, X-Ban Barris, Linda Jewers, Scatterflower, Scott Murray, Charlie H., Wren, Lillian Butler, Quillworth, Madeline Mausoleum, Conna Q, Emily Martins, Duck Grows Chilies, there's always a fun one, Delia the Snake, Lillian Revel, and Kieran Shauna. So grateful for all of you. Have a good one. This channel. Oh my god, could I just be done?